I never thought a single night could destroy everything I believed in, but when I finally saw the truth, there was no going back. This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about the moment you realize the person you love is a stranger. I used to think life had a natural rhythm, a steady, predictable beat that carried you forward whether you were ready for it or not. For years, I moved in time with that rhythm, following the steps laid out before me without hesitation. College, career, marriage, fatherhood, it all fit together like pieces of a song I never questioned. But if I had been listening closely, maybe I would have caught the offbeat moments, the subtle shifts where the music stuttered. Maybe I would have recognized the discord before it grew too loud to ignore. I remember the first time I felt it, that small, almost imperceptible tremor beneath the surface, warning me that something was changing. It was such an unremarkable moment that I might have forgotten it entirely if not for everything that followed. Diana and I were sitting on the porch on a warm, humid evening, watching the boys chase fireflies. She was laughing, but something about it was off. It never quite reached her eyes. "What's on your mind?" I had asked her. She only smiled, shaking her head. "Nothing," she said, brushing me off. And I let it go. I should have pressed her. I should have paid attention to all the little moments like that, the ones I dismissed as nothing. How many times had I mistaken her distance for simple distraction? How often had I confused silence for contentment? I wonder now if there was ever a version of our life where I could have changed the ending before it was written. But deep down I think I always knew. That lingering weight in my chest, that nagging doubt in the back of my mind, it had been whispering the truth for years. No matter how much I loved Diana, no matter what we built together, there was always a part of her I would never be able to reach. And tonight, as I stood in the dimly lit hallway, suitcases by my side and my heart in pieces, I finally accepted it. Diana stood just a few feet away staring at my things, the bags, the laptop, the briefcase by the door. They had been sitting there for a while now, but it was only in that moment that she truly saw them. I watched as she swallowed hard, her breath catching before she turned to face me. "You've lost your mind, Lyle," she said, her voice tight with anger and disbelief. "You're really leaving me and the boys over one fight?" I was drunk. "I messed up, but I didn't cheat. I didn't betray you. You're acting like this is the end of the world." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. She took a step toward me, and without thinking, I lifted a hand, not in anger, not in warning, just to stop her from closing the space between us. She hesitated. And that's when I saw it, the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the way her body shifted ever so slightly. In that moment she understood. This wasn't just frustration or wounded pride. This was something deeper. Something final. Her breath hitched as she took a small step back. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter but steady. "At least tell me why." I let out a slow exhale. "Because I finally see things clearly." Her eyebrows knitted together. "Clearly?" she repeated. "What does that even mean?" She shook her head, her frustration rising. "You always talk like you're the smartest person in the room, like I'm too stupid to get it. Just say it in a way I can actually understand." I rubbed my forehead, knowing there was no gentle way to say what needed to be said. "I'm sorry, Diana," I said, my voice thick with exhaustion. "I don't want to do this. But life traps us. We wake up, go to work, pay bills. We get so caught up in the day-to-day, who's looking at who said what, who's keeping score, that we forget to step back and actually see the big picture. Except sometimes something forces us to." She held her breath, waiting. Tonight, that happened to me. 3 hours earlier, I had pulled into the driveway at exactly 9:30 p.m. My phone had been silent since I left Rivers Trailer Park, south of Palatka. Diana and what felt like half her extended family had been drinking and dancing, just like they did every month. Just like they had for the last 8 years. Our house in Jacksonville, this sprawling city of 1 million people, stood in stark contrast. It was silent, dark, except for the flickering glow of the automatic yard light. As I walked, dragged myself up the driveway, exhaustion settled deep in my bones. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just tired. I was done. I pulled out the same suitcases Diana and I had used on our last cruise to the Bahamas. It felt strange filling them up again, not with swimsuits and sunblock this time, but with shirts, slacks, jackets, my razor, a toothbrush, my meds. Everything I needed to start over. Leaning against the dresser, I felt a wave of nausea creeping in, threatening to rise. I swallowed hard, forcing it back down. This wasn't just a trip. This was an escape. And I wasn't coming back. If I let myself think about it too much, I'd hesitate. So I didn't. I kept moving, one item at a time. Laptop. Briefcase. The work I still needed to finish for college. The phone started ringing. First the house phone. then my cell, then the house phone again. The relentless calls might have been funny once, something I'd roll my eyes at and chuckle about. But whatever part of me had found humor in moments like this had burned out long ago. I wasn't sure I'd find anything amusing again. Not for a long time. Maybe never. I finished my second beer and cracked open a third. I had already lost everything, but some stubborn, delusional part of me still clung to the impossible idea that maybe, just maybe, I could undo tonight. That I could turn back time. But deep down I knew better. I knew I had been fooling myself for years. Diana's family gathered every month for their usual party, dragging out coolers filled with beer and liquor, enough alcohol to drown out any common sense. She and I didn't always go, but we showed up when we could. They expected it. Richard and Ricky, her cousins, had tried their best to make me feel welcome, a northerner, an outsider in their world of good old boys and southern pride. But I was never truly one of them. Real men, in their eyes, sold cars, built homes, fixed engines. Me. I stood in front of disengaged college students talking about literature, something the Carters had no use for. Drinking had started early as it always did. By noon, bottles were already being cracked open. And yet, out of all the men in that world, Diana had chosen me. The Yankee. The misfit. I had pulled Diana away from the long line of southern boys who had once dreamed of claiming her, the kind of men who thought she belonged to them simply because they grew up in the same town, drank at the same bars, and danced to the same country songs. As always, the mix of booze, loud music, and old relationships created tension on the dance floor. Kelly's ex-boyfriend had pressed too close, grinding against her until her husband, Billy, had knocked him flat. 5 minutes later they were shaking hands, laughing like nothing had happened. Then Kelly grabbed Billy by the collar and pulled him into the shadows, where they would either fight or make up, or both. That was how things worked here. I tried to ignore the heat searing through me as I watched Diana sway to the music, tipsy but not stumbling, just loose enough to melt into Bobby's arms. I pushed closer, making sure they could both hear me. "Mind if I cut in, Bobby?" Diana turned to me, her smile slow, lazy, completely unbothered. "Hey baby. Just sharing a dance with Bobby. It's our old prom song, I promised him one. You don't mind, do you?" Bobby smirked, and just to make sure I saw, his left hand slipped beneath the fabric of her blouse, brushing over her chest. It was quick, hidden by the darkness, but not enough to go unnoticed. Laughter trickled through the night, distant and detached, but my pulse roared in my ears. "What the hell did you just say?" I demanded. Diana's expression flickered, like she had only just realized what had slipped out. "Oh Lal," she stammered. "I didn't mean." Before she could finish, Bobby stepped between us, shoving her aside like she was nothing more than an afterthought. "She means," he said, leaning in with a grin, "that if you try anything, I'll knock your teeth in." His voice was calm, confident. Like he had already won. "The only reason I haven't yet is because she keeps begging me not to." He let the words hang there, waiting for them to sink in. Then he laughed. "What kind of man hides behind his wife?" I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. Then Richard's voice cut through the noise. "Enough, Bobby. You've been coming to these parties for years, but this time you crossed the line. Get the hell out." Bobby scoffed, but he knew better than to argue. He threw his hands up in mock surrender and backed away. I turned to Diana, waiting, hoping, for her to say something. She didn't. Instead, she looked away, deliberately avoiding my eyes. "Dad, don't," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Bobby just had too much to drink. He didn't mean anything by it. You know how he and Lyle are, they argue but it's nothing. Besides, I promised him this dance." Even Richard, her own father, looked at her like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. His gaze met mine. "You love someone because you love them, not because you're married to them." I swallowed hard. "Right now, I'm not sure about either." Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Then he reached out, gripping my arm, not forcefully but firm enough to make me pause. Out of respect, I didn't shake him off. "Maybe she was out of line," he admitted, his voice lower now. "Maybe she crossed a line. I can't fix that. I'm just her father. But what I do know is she loves you." I held his gaze, searching for the certainty he seemed to have. "Don't do anything reckless," he said. "Cool off. Have a drink. This will blow over." Maybe. But I already knew I was done. At 12:45 a.m., headlights cut through the darkness as I sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at nothing. The house was silent except for the low hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. If a friend came to me and told me his wife had humiliated him like that in front of everyone, had chosen another man over him, defended another man over him, I'd tell him to pack his things and find someone who wouldn't. And yet here I was, sitting still, listening. Diana had always been the picture-perfect Southern woman, never cursed, never raised her voice, not even behind closed doors. But tonight had shattered a lot of illusions. The front door swung open, the hallway light clicking on. Dave stepped in first. Diana followed close behind. He spotted me instantly. "Hey, Lyle." I looked at him, then at her. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy. Dave hesitated before adding, "You sure you're okay?" I let out a humorless chuckle. "I'm not fine, Dave. Probably won't be for a while. But that's not your problem. Thanks for bringing her home. If it were up to me, she could have stayed with Bobby or crashed at the RV park." Dave glanced between us, exhaling slowly. Then he nodded. "All right." Diana walked me out. I didn't move as they stepped onto the porch. Their voices drifted back from the driveway just outside his truck. Damn him. I could picture Dave shaking his head, arms crossed like some disapproving father watching his kid wreck their life. "Jesus, Dave, grow up," Diana snapped. Dave didn't say anything. She huffed. I got caught up in the moment, all right? It felt good to feel young again. My husband should have taken charge, should have pulled me away, reminded me who I belonged to. But I forgot, he's not that man. Her voice hardened. He's mad now, but it'll pass. One night, one argument, I'll go in there, make it up to him, and by morning this will all be forgotten. People don't split over one fight. Dave let out his own humorless chuckle. "You really believe that?" She sighed. "I don't need another lecture. I've already had plenty. You'd think you were their family and I was some outsider with the way they've been talking to me. But I was drunk, all right? And so was Bobby." Pause. Then she added, "You know our history. We've known each other since we were kids. He never really got over the fact that I picked you instead of him. I feel bad for him, I really do." I arched a brow, my grip tightening on the beer bottle in my hand. "So what? You let him grope you out of pity?" Her expression darkened, irritation flashing in her eyes. "He's been struggling a little," she said, as if that explained anything. "We all did. But that doesn't mean I don't care. Things just got crazy." I didn't blink. "Crazy how?" She swallowed hard. "After you walked off, I danced with Bobby. I was pissed. I know you're not the kind of guy who throws punches, but God, Lyle, this sounds so immature," she said, her voice tight. "It hurt that you didn't even try. If he had touched you, I would have been there, loving on you, taking care of you. That's what I wanted. But you just walked away instead. So yeah, I was upset and I danced with him." Her voice dropped lower. "He was roaming around and you didn't even stop to wonder where I was." Diana bit her lip, looking away. Then it clicked. "You weren't even there, were you?" My voice was steady but my chest tightened. "You went with him. To the hospital?" Her eyes met mine, hesitant at first, then bold. Defiant. "He was hurt, Lyle. He was in pain. He asked me to go with him. And you couldn't say no," I said flatly. "It was the right thing to do," she snapped. "If you weren't so mad you'd see that." "Of course she caught herself, took a breath, then shook her head. "He's an old friend. One you used to sleep with," I finished for her. Her expression softened. "Did you even think about me?" I didn't answer. She looked down. "Lyle, that's not fair. There was so much going on. Bobby was hurt, people were scrambling, trying to figure things out. So the answer is no." She didn't argue. "When did someone finally remember I existed?" Her voice was quieter now. "After they patched Bobby up. His brother came to pick him up. I rode back with Kelly and Billy. When I got here, Dad asked if I had seen you." I let out a slow, bitter laugh. "That's great. Your father was the one who thought to ask." I turned, glancing at the packed suitcases, my laptop, my briefcase, everything ready to go. A few seconds later, she returned, moving slower this time, shaking her head in disbelief, as if her mind refused to process what she was seeing. "You're really doing this, Lyle?" Her voice wavered between frustration and desperation. "You're seriously leaving me and the boys over one argument?" She swallowed hard. "I was drunk, all right? I made a stupid mistake, but I didn't cheat," Diana insisted, her voice rising. "I didn't do anything that should make you throw our whole life away. You're acting insane." I didn't respond. She exhaled sharply, frustration clear in every movement. "Lyle, we get so caught up in the little things, whether we're gaining weight, whether our spouse is looking at someone else, that we forget to step back and see the bigger picture. We don't realize how far we've drifted until something forces us to." She was waiting for me to say something. To reassure her. I didn't. "Tonight, I finally saw the truth," I said instead. She shook her head, her jaw tightening. "You keep saying that, but what does that even mean?" What did you see? This was the hardest thing I'd ever had to say. Because I knew that once the words left my mouth, there would be no taking them back. No second chances. I was severing us. She must have sensed it too. How can you be so cruel? She whispered. I met her gaze, my voice steady. Answer 2 questions. And if I'm wrong, I'll stay. A flicker of fear crossed her face, like she already knew what was coming. Have you ever cheated on me, Diana? Silence. Have you been with another man since we got married? She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence told me everything. Thank you, I murmured. Her lips parted slightly, confusion flickering in her expression. That's why I still love you, I said. Because you could have lied. You could have spun a half-truth. But you won't lie to me, because you know I already know. A sharp inhale, her throat working as she tried to find something to say. Oh my God. I stared at her, my voice empty, drained of any warmth. You never say my name when we're in bed, Diana. You've never sounded the way you did with someone else. You just let me do what I do. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Do you really think I haven't noticed how little you want me? She stopped moving. Hesitated. Then, slowly, her fingers trembled as she reached out, brushing against my face. Her fingertips traced the swollen flesh around my nearly swollen shut eye. I knew what she was seeing, bruises, deep purple fading into sickly yellow. A body that would heal. A man who would survive. But I had never felt as beaten down as I did now. Because this wasn't about fists or broken ribs. This wasn't about a fight that left scars on the skin. This was about knowing, deep down, that the fight had been over long before tonight. Taking a beating wasn't what scared me. That wasn't what held me back. It was the way she had looked at me when Bobby provoked me, the way she had challenged me, daring me to react. The way she had let him touch her, hold her, move his hands over her like he had every right to. And somewhere deep down I had always known. The sound Bobby made wasn't a cry, just a sharp exhale as my fist connected, knocking the breath from his lungs. Before he could recover, I shoved him back with enough force to make him stagger. His body jolted from the blow, and this time he let out a deep, guttural groan. I swung again, aiming for his groin, but he twisted at the last second, and my boot glanced off his thigh instead. His hand shot out, grabbing my leg, and with one brutal yank he knocked me off balance. I hit the ground hard, my back slamming against the dirt. Pain exploded through my ribs, but I pushed up onto my elbows, sheer desperation kicking in. Bobby loomed over me, throwing another punch. I twisted my head just in time. His fist barely grazed my temple, and the momentum sent him staggering. That was my chance. I rolled away, scrambled to my feet. My ribs screamed in protest, but I forced myself upright. Bobby was already pushing himself up. But just as he got to his knees, I drove my boot into his face. His head snapped back with a sickening crunch and he collapsed onto his back, groaning. I went for another kick. But he was faster. His arm shot out, catching my leg. Before I could shake him off, he heaved forward, knocking me off balance again. He hit the ground gasping, his entire body convulsing from the pain. Somewhere in the distance, I heard voices through the night. I wasn't sure if anyone could hear him. But no one was coming. I dropped onto his chest, my knee pressing down hard on his forearm, the other pinning his elbow. His breath hitched, his body going rigid beneath me, agony rendering him speechless. I slammed my knee into his elbow, once, twice, until I felt the joint give slightly under the pressure. Then I leaned in, shifting my full weight onto the limb, keeping him pinned like a wounded animal. Go to hell, he muttered, his voice ragged. You can find your own way there, I said, driving my elbow into his ribs. Twice. He recoiled from the hit, struggling to catch his breath as he tried to push me off. But he was weak, too weak to fight back. I grabbed his right hand, prying his fingers apart with deliberate force. He let out a strained grunt, his body tensing in pain. I'm going to ask you a few questions, Bobby, I said, my voice calm, almost indifferent. And you're going to answer honestly. He glared at me through swollen eyes, his breath shallow. Go screw yourself. I twisted his mangled hand, pressing my thumb hard against his pinky. Say that again and no one will ever find your body. Bobby clenched his jaw, his lips curling into something that almost resembled amusement. How long? I asked. How long have you been asleep with my wife? For a moment he was silent. Then, slowly, a smirk crept across his bloodied face. You mean this time or before? My stomach twisted. I already knew about before. I'm talking about since we got married, I said through gritted teeth. His smirk faded. When he spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. Almost casual. And somehow that made it worse. For years. The words hit me like a hammer to the chest. For years, I felt something inside me crack, something beyond bone and muscle. Bobby nodded. Yeah. I forced myself to breathe, my grip tightening. I figured she'd leave you after that, he continued, wincing as he shifted under my weight. Then the next day I showed up at your house. Went to grab her, told her we didn't have to sneak around anymore. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. And she slapped me across the face. Screamed she'd call the cops. Have me arrested? I wanted to end him. His breath hitched, his whole body trembling at the memory. I was furious, he admitted, voice raw. She was just a liar. A cheating liar. He exhaled sharply, then continued. I stayed away for 3 months. Tried to move on. But one night, out of nowhere, she showed up at my door. Didn't say a word. Just stood there waiting. His eyes darkened, resentment pooling beneath the pain. I didn't let go. Sorry about that, I muttered, twisting his wrist just slightly. Guess I wasn't paying attention. His bloodied eyes met mine, filled with something unspoken, something deeper than hate. I'm going to make you suffer, Lyle. I barely heard him. My ears were ringing, my breath uneven. I didn't want to know more. But I had to. It was like pressing a blade into an open wound, knowing it would only deepen the pain but unable to stop myself. I reached for his third finger. He tensed as if considering whether to fight back. But then he slumped, his body giving in. And that's when he said it. You know, she told me once that she could fall asleep while you were on top of her. That's how exciting you are. Rage boiled in my veins. You put her to sleep, Lyle, he sneered. But me? I make her scream. Something inside me snapped. For the first time in my life, I wanted to eliminate someone. And for a few seconds, maybe I actually thought I would. Instead, I settled for another snap. His fourth finger broke beneath my grip, the sharp crack cutting through the night. His body arched in agony, but before he could scream, I pressed my other hand against his throat, muffling his cries. When he finally went limp beneath me, I froze. What the hell was I doing? Mutilating a man because I couldn't measure up to what my wife wanted? Because I couldn't satisfy her? Bobby wasn't the one who had betrayed me. She was. He had only done what countless men before him had done. The blame wasn't his to carry, it was hers. I released him, stepping back as he curled into himself, instinctively shielding what I had threatened to take. My head was pounding, my ribs screaming in pain, but I forced myself to turn away to walk. Then his voice followed me. You really think I'm the bad guy here? I didn't stop. Didn't turn around. You want to blame me? Fine, he rasped, his swollen lips curling into something that almost resembled a smirk. But look at her now. I kept moving, but his words dug in deep, like glass beneath the skin. She tried, man, he continued, his voice hoarse but still mocking. She really tried to love you. She tried to pretend she could live without passion. Tried to be the wife you needed her to be. I clenched my fist. And me? He coughed, spitting blood onto the dirt. I had to hide in the shadows, waiting for her to remember. What she really wanted, Bobby rasped, his breath uneven. And you, poor creep, you'll always be second place. I kept walking, fists clenched so tight my nails bit into my palms. Every time you touch her, every time she closes her eyes, you'll wonder who she's really thinking about. I swallowed hard, willing myself not to turn around. And you know what? He let out a low, ragged laugh. Maybe you'll even learn to live with it. Diana's voice was softer now, raw with something I couldn't place. If I had told you, she said, that I felt something was missing, if I had just come to you and said we could fix it, try something new, I don't know, pills, toys, anything. She wiped at her eyes, shaking her head. But how? Her voice broke. How could I tell the man I loved that another man made me feel things he never could? I stood there, my whole body cold. No one's ego could survive that, she whispered. My jaw tightened. Then why didn't you leave me? If he was everything you wanted? Because he wasn't, she interrupted, her voice barely audible. I exhaled sharply, struggling to process it all. So what, he was just sex, she said. Yes. But love? No. She lifted her eyes to mine, searching. That was always you, Lyle? For the briefest second, something shifted. For the first time all night, I saw the truth in her expression. And it shattered me all over again. No, I murmured, my voice heavy with sorrow. I love you. That's what makes this so hard. She let out a shaky breath, waiting. But you can't bring something back to life once it's already dead. Her face crumpled, hands covering her mouth as sobs racked her body. I didn't hear the door open. But I heard it close. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed through the silence, final and absolute. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space where she had been, at the suitcase by my feet, at the life we had built that was now reduced to fragments. My hands trembled, my breath shallow, but the numbness was starting to set in, wrapping around me like a second skin. It was over. And yet, my mind kept replaying her words over and over. That was always you, Lyle? If that were true, then why? Why had she let him touch her? Why had she gone back to him again and again for 4 years? Why had she only admitted it when she had no other choice? Because she didn't love him. That's what she said. But love alone had never been enough. I moved on autopilot, grabbing my suitcase, my laptop, my briefcase. I walked out without looking back, stepping into the thick, humid night. The air was heavy, suffocating, but at least out here I could breathe. The driveway was empty. The street was quiet. The world kept moving, indifferent to what had just happened inside that house. I climbed into my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. And for the first time in my life, I had no idea where I was supposed to go. I sat there, staring through the windshield at nothing. The engine hummed beneath my fingers, steady, waiting. But I wasn't ready to move. The reality of it all pressed down on me, the weight of the past 10 years, the nights I had spent loving her, trusting her, building a life that I thought was unshakable. Now all of it was dust. I could still hear her voice in my head. That was always you, Lyle. It didn't matter. Love should have been enough. But it wasn't. I exhaled, the sound shaky, raw. My ribs ached, my body battered and bruised, not just from the fight but from everything. From the truth. My phone buzzed against the console. I ignored it. Then again. And again. I glanced down. A text from Diana. Please. Just talk to me. I shut my eyes, gripping the back of my neck. I wanted to say something, anything, but what was left? What words could fix this? Another buzz. Come home. Home. The word felt hollow. Whatever that place was, it wasn't mine anymore. I turned the key, the engine growling to life. And then, without another glance at the house behind me, I pulled away. The tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled onto the road, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was anything but. Everything was raw. Diana's voice, Bobby's smirk, the way the past 10 years had unraveled in the span of a few hours. Another text buzzed. Then another. I reached for the phone, barely glancing at the screen. Diana, Lyle, please. Diana, just come back so we can talk. Diana, I don't want it to end like this. I clenched my jaw and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. It was already over. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, just the glow of my headlights cutting through the night. I had no destination, no plan. I just drove, letting the silence settle in, letting the truth sink deep into my bones. At some point, I pulled into an old gas station off the highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering weakly. I stepped out of the car, my body stiff, aching, the adrenaline finally draining from my system. The air smelled like asphalt and stale cigarettes. Inside, a bored-looking cashier barely glanced up as I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of aspirin. As I stood at the counter, my phone vibrated again. I ignored it. The cashier rang me up, sliding the receipt across the counter. Rough night? He asked, his voice disinterested. I exhaled, rubbing my forehead. You have no idea. Back in the car, I cracked open the bottle of water, swallowing the aspirin dry. My phone was still lighting up, but I didn't check. Instead, I let my head fall back against the seat, staring at the ceiling. This was real. I wasn't going home. And for the first time in a long time, I had no idea what came next. I sat in that gas station parking lot for what felt like hours, the weight of everything settling in. The truth. The finality. The quiet realization that the life I had built, every plan, every sacrifice, every moment I thought was leading somewhere, was gone. Eventually I picked up my phone. The screen was flooded with missed calls, unread messages, all from Diana. I didn't open them. Instead, I scrolled to the contact labeled home, a word that didn't mean anything anymore. My thumb hovered over it for a second. Then I hit delete. I started the car and pulled back onto the road, the gas station shrinking in my rearview just like the house had. Where was I going? I didn't know. Maybe to a hotel. Maybe to a friend's couch. Maybe nowhere at all. But for the first time in years, I was making a choice for myself. Not for Diana. Not for a broken marriage. Not for a version of my life that didn't exist anymore. Just me. And that would have to be enough. The end.